Hi, Andrew here from Systemic Creative. We're here to talk about systems archetypes. Thanks for joining us. It is part of a series, so if you've seen this introduction 15 times before, do feel free to skip it. I won't be offended. At Systemic Creative, we are here to help organisations and businesses grow and develop, to be more productive, more effective and more resilient, but at the same time to have better well-being throughout, happier staff, happier teams and a happier, more positive organisation as a result. We look at the organisation as an organism, and this is a paradigm which helps us to make leaps into how to change organisational dynamics for the better. It's a blend of systems dynamics, systems thinking, leadership, teamship and most importantly listenership. Now, our organisational development programme has been described as groundbreaking, paradigm shifting and experiential reprogramming and radicalising the way that people work, among other things. So do check out the links in the description below to our programme if that's of interest to yourself, your business or your organisation or community group or whatever. And of course, do subscribe to our channel for more content. We also have some fun stuff on the channel as well, what the team get up to and some fun projects and things like that. So you can join us for those sorts of things as well. So we're here to talk today about systems archetypes. Now, systems archetypes are part of the wider discipline of systems thinking, which is something which was pioneered really by Donella Meadows back in the 1970s with her release of a seminal work, Limits to Growth, which is also the name of a systems archetype, which was the first, and it's one that Donella Meadows came up with and articulated in the book. Now, I highly recommend Donella Meadows' work, particularly for people who are new to systems thinking. She's a great teacher and a brilliant thinker, so do look her up on the web. You'll find her on YouTube as well, so look into Donella Meadows. Well, systems archetypes are also called systems traps, and the reason for that is it's an archetypal set of system dynamics into which almost any system can fall if you're not careful, particularly human systems. Organisations, businesses, community groups, anything that involves people can fall into these systems traps, and generally speaking they are things that can be quite destructive and that we would want to avoid. So in these talks we'll look at each archetype, we'll describe the archetypal system dynamics, we'll look at some real world examples of it, we'll look at what the leverage points in the system are, and arguably most important, we'll look at how to avoid falling into those systems traps, and if we're already in it, how we get out of it. We will assume a bit of systems language knowledge already, but we'll also do our best to describe things and how they work as we go through the talk. Okay, let's dive into today's talk. Escalation, everybody's favourite systems archetype. It's very common and it's familiar to the vast majority of people. Here we've got a particular example of an escalating system. Rather than using an arbitrary diagram, I felt it would be easier to use a specific example and one which is familiar to most people who are familiar with recent history, relatively recent history. So this represents the Cold War or the Cuban Missile Crisis, which is a perfect example of the escalation systems archetype or systems trap. Now, this is quite a simple systems archetype, but it's also quite interesting in that it's a little bit more complex than it first appears. So, I won't go into the Cold War and the Cuban Missile Crisis. I assume that most viewers of this video understand what happened, basically. So, in the middle here, we've got the ratio of nuclear capability of the USA to the USSR. USSR as it was then. Now remember, a ratio mathematically is one thing divided by another. So if this increases, it means that the USA is more capable than the USSR, and if it decreases, the opposite is true. So the USA is in the numerator, the USSR is in the denominator of the ratio or the fraction. So the ratio of nuclear capability of the USA to the USSR is the centre of this diagram. Now, coming out of here, we've got, let's go around the US side first, we've got the threat, the Soviet threat, and this is the development of arms, of course, by the USSR, causes a threat to the USA. So here we've got an arrow coming down and we've got an O there for opposite. So what that means is if this ratio increases, the Soviet threat decreases. If this ratio decreases, the Soviet threat increases, because it means that the USSR is more nuclear capable than the USA. So if this increases, the Soviet threat increases, the US starts developing arms and positioning arms and getting nuclear missiles ready to launch and that kind of thing. So the US develops its armory capability. And there's an S there for same. So this is typical for causal loop diagramming. Arrows are usually marked with opposites or sames, and it just means that when this increases, this also increases. So as the threat increases, the US increases its development of arms. And that feeds back into this ratio, and it increases the ratio because the USA becomes more capable. Now at the same time, what's happening here is that when this ratio increases, the threat to the USSR, or the perceived threat to the USSR, also increases. So we've got an S there for same. And when this increases, lo and behold, the USSR develops its armory, develops its capability, building its new weapons, positions them ready for attack, and so forth. Sends missiles down to Cuba, you know, in this case of the Cuban Missile Crisis. And what this does, it has the opposite effect on this ratio, because it makes the USSR more nuclear capable than the US. Now these are balancing feedback loops. These are both balancing this ratio in the middle. So you might think, well, if these are both balancing feedback loops, how is this an escalating systems archetype? How is this escalation? And what happens is, if you follow this in a figure of 8, which is how it happens in reality, that's how you get a single reinforcing feedback loop. That's how you get the escalation. It's going through this in a figure of 8, because what happens in reality, both countries were equally capable. One develops more arms to threaten the other. So then the other develops more arms in response to that. So the other one develops more arms in response to that, and so forth and so forth. And what happens is it builds into a crisis. And in this case, it's the Cuban Missile Crisis. So it brought the world to the brink of total destruction, brought the world to the brink of complete disaster, nuclear war. And that's an extreme example of the Escalation Systems Archetype. It's a very good one because it's very clear and it's one that people are familiar with. So what are some other, maybe less dramatic, real world examples, and perhaps ones that affect us and our organisations? Well, a really familiar one is your classic domestic argument. You start off arguing about the washing up, and you end up with one person storming out and the other person accusing them of being a terrible excuse for a human being, and everything they've ever achieved in their life is totally worthless and they're just pathetic. Right? So that's a perfect example of an escalating systems archetype. One goes up to beat them, one goes up to beat them, and so on and so forth. So a domestic argument. We see it also with retribution and revenge, with gangs in particular. So someone perhaps trades drugs on somebody else's turf in their area. So somebody responds with violence, perhaps a leg breaking or something like that. Somebody responds with further violence, perhaps a stabbing. Somebody responds with a shooting and killing, and it goes on and on. So that's a common example of the systems archetype, the escalation systems archetype as well. Something pernicious which can often go unnoticed in organisations is over-competitiveness. So general competitiveness in a team or workplace. So one person is trying to get recognition by the boss or by a board of directors or some other authority in the hierarchy. And so somebody else tries to better them, somebody else tries to better them, and what happens is the competitiveness escalates, but usually the quality of what's going on can decrease, and that's actually better exemplified in another systems archetype called Race to the Bottom, and we'll come to that at another time. But that's an escalation, and that can cause some real difficulties within an organisation. Another example would be political smear campaigns. So somebody starts by deriding the opposition in an election. So somebody responds by deriding their opposition, going backwards even more. So somebody releases some rumour, somebody leaks some papers, somebody releases some footage, and it all gets into a bit of a childish mess, if I'm honest. So those are all examples of the escalation systems archetype in action, and it happens all the time. Road rage is another one. We're all really familiar with this. So what are the leverage points in this system? A key facet of systems thinking is leverage points. How do we make a difference to the archetype with the smallest amount of input? Where can we have the biggest effect? And for me, the leverage points of the escalation systems archetype are in the threats and the perception, the perceived threat and the reaction to it. So it's these blocks here in the arrows. That's where we can make the difference. So how do we do that? How do we make the difference? How do we avoid it, or how do we get out of it once we're in escalation? Now, one of the best examples of getting out of this is the story of Vasili Arkhipov. Now, you may not be familiar. You're probably familiar with the Cuban Missile Crisis. You may not be familiar with Vasili Arkhipov. So here is the story of Vasili Arkhipov. He was the commander of a fleet of submarines for the USSR during the Cold War, and particularly in the Cuban Missile Crisis. And there was a fleet of 3 submarines, of which he was the commander, and he was aboard one of them. They were around Cuba, off the coast of the USA, and they were below the level at which they could receive US civilian radio. So they couldn't receive any radio contact because they were too deep. And because they were so deep, and because the batteries on the submarine, the power supply was running low, it got very hot and very stressful. It was a really stressful environment. And at the same time, US destroyers were on the surface of the ocean, and they were looking obviously for Russian nuclear capable submarines, of which Vasili Arkhipov's was one, and they found Arkhipov's submarine. So what they did was they started dropping depth charges, signalling depth charges, in order to force the submarine to come to the surface and identify itself. But when you're very, very deep in a submarine and you hear massive explosions going off to the left and right, it's very easy to think you're in nuclear war, or you're in some kind of battle situation, particularly when feelings are running high, the temperature's through the roof, there's very high levels of carbon dioxide, nobody's able to think straight. So here we've got an escalation within an escalation, right? We've got the Cold War and the Cuban Missile Crisis, which is our classical archetypical escalation, but we've also got an escalation going on in that submarine, an escalation of everybody's stress level, So when the captain heard these depth charges going off, his thought was, we're in nuclear war, we need to fire our nuclear weapon. We need to fire our missile, that's what we're here to do. And the political officer who was on board the submarine agreed with the captain. Now, normally on a USSR submarine of that time, it required the captain of the sub and the political officer on board the sub to authorise the launch. Now, because in this instance the commander of the fleet was there, Vasili Arkhipov, he also had to authorise the launch of that missile. Now, as the story goes, a huge argument broke out. The captain and the political officer were all for launching the missile, but Vasili said, hang on a minute, wait a minute. There are depth charges to our left, there are depth charges to our right, and they are happening on a regular basis. We're hearing one to the left, one to the right, one to the left. We're not being attacked. This isn't an attack. If the Americans were attacking us, they'd be firing right at us. They wouldn't be rhythmically sending depth charges to our left and right. And he said, we need to calm down. We need to surface. We need to go to the surface. So this argument continued, and the captain and political officer, saw that as giving up, as resigning. And Vasili Arkhipov, his point was, if we fire this nuclear weapon, the world as we know it will end. We cannot take that risk unless we absolutely know it's the right thing to do. And ultimately, because of his seniority and because he'd also done stuff in the past which had earned him a lot of respect within the Navy, he prevailed and the submarine surfaced. And it's entirely possible, if not probable, that that moment and the clear thinking of Vasili Arkhipov prevented all-out World War III nuclear war. And John F. Kennedy described it as not only the most important moment in the war, but arguably the most dangerous and most important moment of human history. Because if they'd fired that nuclear missile, lots of other nuclear missiles would have been fired. And as the story goes on, you can find out more about Vasili Arkhipov on the internet. I suggest you do. It's an interesting story, he's an interesting character. For our purposes here, the biggest lesson there from that story is we need to take a step back, we need to be rational, and we need to think clearly if we are to avoid or get out of the escalation systems archetype. We need to be more Vasili Arkhipov. We need to stop, we need to think carefully about what's happening, and we need to think about the big picture. What is at stake here? Are the actions that we are taking in this environment proportional to what is required to achieve our goals, achieve our aims, make the world a better place or a safer place or whatever it is that we're aiming for as a whole? And we need to be able to do that whilst under extreme pressure. So we need to practice doing that. Another possible way of avoiding it or getting out of it is to bring in a third party or an unbiased outsider. So that's another way to de-escalate situations, and you often see that in a political sphere. Sometimes that's seen within the disciplinary procedures within a company or an organisation. An unbiased party is brought in to resolve something. Mediation is an example of that. So bringing in a third party, that's another way to avoid or get out of it. And the concept of teamship, the concept of cooperation. We need to think, look, we are a team. And even if the escalation is occurring with who we perceive to be another team, at the end of the day, we're all trying to achieve the same things, and we all want a safer and better world in which to operate. So thinking of humanity or each other or other systems as a big team, how can we actually cooperate rather than compete to the point of destruction? Because that's where the escalation systems archetype goes in the end. It's no good for anybody. It's no good for us. It's no good for who we see as the opposition. So think about opportunities to cooperate and work as a team. I hope that's been useful. Thank you for watching. Do have a look for the other systems archetypes in this series of talks. There are links in the description below, and do check out the link to our organisational development programme, as mentioned in the introduction, and there are links to that below as well. Thank you for your time.